In the late 1980s, Japan experienced an RPG boom, starting with popular computer titles like the Black Onyx and Xanadu, and exploding into the mainstream with the Dragon Quest series for the Famicom, better known in the West as the Nintendo Entertainment System. This tidal wave of success spawned a host of imitators hoping to cash in on a hot trend, but it also paved the way for some genuine contenders. And among those rare few titles was one that would eventually come to rival and even surpass Dragon Quest on a global scale. The last-ditch effort of a struggling developer looking for their first smash hit. This is my retrospective review of Final Fantasy, the game that saved a company. Final Fantasy was released for the Famicom in Japan on December 18, 1987. And being a game from the old school of Japanese RPGs, it follows many of the genre conventions to the letter. The game begins by asking you to create a party of 4 characters using any combination of 6 different classes, or in Final Fantasy lingo, jobs. These are the Warriors of Light, 4 young heroes destined to save the world from a great evil. Your quest takes you across a large overworld split into 3 great continents, full of diverse locations as well as barriers to travel that can only be overcome by acquiring more advanced modes of transportation. You'll start your adventure on foot, but eventually get your hands on a ship that lets you sail on the ocean, a canoe that can go on the river, and finally, an airship that soars through the skies. Wandering around the wilderness triggers random encounters with monsters that must be defeated to win experience points and gold, and you'll have to fight a lot of these to get strong enough to beat the game. Combat is turn-based and with a tactical component, using what is sometimes known as a phased system, where you select the actions of each character in a preparation phase before seeing it all play out in the execution phase. Towns and castles offer safe havens where you can recover your strength, save your game, and upgrade your equipment. Towns are also full of NPCs that provide information about the world as well as important hints on where to go next. To advance the story, you'll have to make your way into the game's dungeons. These caves, temples, and other treacherous locations are sprawling labyrinths filled with monsters, treasure, and deadly boss encounters to overcome. To complete your quest, you must restore light to the 4 elemental crystals of wind, water, fire, and earth, before diving into the distant past to seek out the true mastermind behind the world's woes. But you have a long journey ahead of you, and there's plenty of tasks to complete before you get that far. As familiar as this formula might seem, Final Fantasy was still a very early console RPG. And as with many of these titles from the late 80s, the game also lacks some of the features we'd come to expect from this genre. There's no elaborate story told through extensive cutscenes, no set-piece scenarios or special events to take part in. There are only a handful of supporting characters, barely any dialogue at all, and the heroes you control are nothing more than player avatars, blank slates for you to project your own thoughts and feelings onto. A lot of the presentation is still done through text. Characters have no special abilities aside from magic, and even something as basic as the possibility of getting item drops from defeated monsters is missing from this game. At its core, Final Fantasy is a pretty straightforward dungeon crawler with an extensive overworld to explore, and the story mostly plays out in your head. But the game was incredibly ambitious for a console title of its time. There was a huge world to discover, a host of monsters to challenge, and an arsenal of weapons and spells to play around with. And since the game lets you create your own party at the start of the adventure, every new quest would be slightly different. But there was also a lot riding on this title. The Final Fantasy series has come a long way since 1987, and the company behind it has become a corporate juggernaut. But back in the mid-80s, what we now know as Square Enix was a relatively unknown developer. And for a small company still finding its feet in the gaming industry, Final Fantasy was a huge gamble. Today, the company behind the Final Fantasy series is called Square Enix, but in the 80s and 90s, they were simply known as Square. originally a subsidiary of an electric power company called Den-Yu-Sha operating out of the island of Shikoku, Square was established in Yokohama in 1983 by Masafumi Miyamoto, son of Den-Yu-Sha's owner Kuniichi Miyamoto. After graduating from Waseda University, the younger Miyamoto wasn't keen to follow in his father's footsteps and started looking for opportunities of his own. He initially thought to manufacture women's clothing, but his eyes soon turned to an entirely different field, an emerging industry which was seeing meteoric levels of economic growth. Arcade games had taken Japan by storm in the late 70s, pioneered by titles like Breakout and the homegrown mega hit Space Invaders. The early 80s saw the emergence of a small but rapidly expanding market for computer games, powered by affordable personal computers like the MSX, NEC PC-88, FM7, and Sharp X1. Here, Miyamoto thought there was money to be made by a shrewd businessman. Miyamoto wasn't particularly skilled at software development, but he had a vision for how games should be made that was well ahead of its time. In the 1980s, video games were typically created by a single person who did everything from game design to programming, graphics, and music. Miyamoto realized that to stay relevant within the rapidly developing game industry, companies would have to enlist the services of entire teams of multi-talented individuals. Graphics designers, programmers, composers, and professional writers would need to work together to create digital experiences that could make the most out of increasingly sophisticated hardware. What Miyamoto needed was to find these people. Back then, game development wasn't really a career, so to recruit for his new company, Miyamoto had to get creative. His solution was to open up a computer salon, a kind of PC bang or internet cafe without the internet, where customers could rent PCs for an hourly fee. The salon became quite popular with the students of nearby universities, who were PC enthusiasts but couldn't afford to buy their own computers. But the salon's true purpose was to put Miyamoto in contact with students who had programming skills. This tactic ended up paying off. Miyamoto's first hire was Hisashi Suzuki, the man who would later succeed him as president and CEO of the company. Suzuki, once onboarded, immediately turned his attention toward recruiting others like himself. To do so, he took out job ads in classified magazines, announcing that the company was hiring part-time workers. And these ads would end up paying huge dividends. In 1983, Hironobu Sakaguchi was a 21-year-old student at Yokohama National University, but academic life was pretty much the farthest thing from his mind. He spent his time mostly at pachinko parlors, the movies, or playing arcade games, and his highest ambition was to become a professional musician. It was around this time that Sakaguchi became good friends with one of his fellow classmates, a computer geek named Hiromichi Tanaka. Tanaka introduced Sakaguchi to the world of the Apple II and Western games, including state-of-the-art computer role-playing games like Ultima and Wizardry. Entranced by the possibilities of this new hobby, Sakaguchi was soon taken to the back streets of Akihabara with Tanaka to look for counterfeit parts with which to build his own computer. But even counterfeit computer parts cost money, and Sakaguchi didn't have any. So he and Tanaka started to look for a part-time job in the software industry. But established software development companies weren't really hiring college students with no real experience beyond tinkering with an Apple II. Instead, they found an ad for a company that was looking for office staff for a new business that rented out game equipment. And the company's name was Square. When Sakaguchi first joined Square, he thought he'd be doing some sort of administrative tasks. Instead, he was immediately put to work producing video games. Sakaguchi's and Square's first game was The Death Trap, a text adventure with a Cold War spy aesthetic set in a war-torn African country and featuring elaborate on-screen illustrations to go along with the narrative. Sakaguchi designed the game and wrote most of its story, while Tanaka served as one of two programmers. An additional 9 people were brought on to handle scenario writing, graphics, and data editing. All of them, including Sakaguchi and Tanaka, working part-time for the company. First released in October of 1984 for the NEC PC-88 series of computers, the most popular home computer in Japan at the time, the Death Trap went on to sell about 100,000 copies, which at the time was considered a success. The positive reception was enough to allow for a sequel, Will the Death Trap 2, which would become Square's first true claim to fame. Although it didn't sell as well as they'd hoped, the game's full-screen animations were considered groundbreaking at the time, gaining the company plenty of attention. Square were keeping the lights on developing computer games, but they couldn't ignore what was going on across the aisle. Because while PC gaming remained the domain of a relatively small number of hardcore enthusiasts, another, more accessible form of video games was being introduced into millions of homes across Japan. And the companies riding that wave were making fortunes. Launched on July 15th of 1983, Nintendo's Family Computer, or Famicom, brought about a revolution in the video game industry. It would only set you back a fraction of the cost of a computer, but offered arcade-quality experiences in the comfort of your own living room. The software was plug and play, had no load times, and offered a user experience so simple a 5-year-old child could figure it out. And best of all, it had an incredible library of first-party titles like Ice Climber, Excitebike, and Super Mario Bros. Square were slow to adapt to this growing market. Around 1985, they had signed a third-party development contract with Nintendo, becoming only the 7th company to do so. But aside from porting a single game, they didn't actually do anything with it. The reason behind this was a matter of attitude. Square saw themselves as makers of sophisticated computer software, while the Famicom was a children's toy. They also felt their strengths were better suited to PC development and lacked confidence in developing action games, which at the time made up the majority of the Famicom library. But by 1986, Nintendo had sold 6.5 million Famicoms in a country of 38 million households, and the trend showed no signs of slowing down. For Masafumi Miyamoto, a market this big was simply impossible to ignore. And when his mind was made up, he moved quickly. Their first original title for the Famicom was King's Knight, a scrolling shooter with a fantasy setting. Square, until now a subsidiary of Miyamoto's father's company, was set up as an independent corporation. And to add a sense of legitimacy to the operation and attract investors, Miyamoto relocated their offices from Yokohama to upscale Ginza, in the very heart of Tokyo. By mid-1987, Square had completely quit the PC market and gone all in on the Famicom. But by the time Square finally got into the game, the gold rush days of the Famicom were coming to an end. Early on, Nintendo had opened the door to third-party developers, and they were more than eager to add to the console's large library of games, even if it hurt the overall offering. While Nintendo's own titles were consistently of high quality, other companies flooded the market with garbage. And for a time, it seemed as if history was repeating itself. Between 1983 and 1985, the United States had experienced a historic video game crash, where over the course of 2 years, the once booming industry declined by almost 97%. While this crash had multiple contributing factors, a major one was the large number of low-quality titles on offer. By 1983, consumers had simply grown tired of crappy games. When Nintendo of America brought the Famicom to North America, they were very well aware that in spite of the quality of the product, they had a big task on their hands if they wanted to avoid crashing and burning in the wake of the Great Collapse. Even the branding reflected this reality. It was called the Nintendo Entertainment System to add an air of sophistication to the product and divert attention away from the fact that it was, in reality, a video game console. But in order to maintain consumer confidence over time, Nintendo of America knew they had to take drastic measures. To safeguard the quality of the games released on the console, the company applied strict licensing standards, ensuring that only the best games were released in North America, and came up with the Nintendo Seal of Quality, an official stamp put on the box of every licensed game to indicate that this was the real deal. But neither this seal of quality nor the stringent licensing process were present in Japan. As long as developers had a third-party agreement with Nintendo, they were free to shovel as much crap onto the market as they could stomach. And by 1986, it was starting to stink. Despite several highly successful titles like Castlevania, Metroid, and The Legend of Zelda, the market for Famicom games was starting to cool down. Square were no exception to this trend. Their games were selling, but not as well as their competitors. To boost turnover, they started cranking out a larger number of less distinct games, trying to stay afloat. They were making money, but their margins got thinner and thinner, and with their fancy offices in Ginza, at times they were more or less working just to pay the rent. Faced with a do-or-die situation, Masafumi Miyamoto made some drastic changes. He moved their office out of the city center, laid off half of his employees, and split the remaining 30 people into teams. With the company's survival on the line, Miyamoto asked the team leaders to pitch ideas for games that might save it. For Hironobu Sakaguchi, this provided a rare opportunity. He'd been holding on to an idea for his dream project, the game he'd always wanted to make. A title so ambitious it had seemed like an impossible task, until someone else went ahead and did it. In 1987, the Japanese gaming community was firmly in the grips of RPG fever. Released for the Famicom in May of the previous year, the fantasy role-playing game Dragon Quest hadn't been an immediate hit, but bolstered by Akira Toriyama's distinctive artwork and an aggressive marketing campaign in the pages of Weekly Shonen Jump, Japan's premier manga anthology for boys and young men, sales eventually picked up speed. A game with the scale and scope of a computer RPG translated into a format that was fun and accessible for kids and released on a home console proved to be an incredibly potent formula. And by the time the sequel came out 7 months later, that momentum had built into mass hysteria. This was an opportunity Sakaguchi wanted to capitalize on, but he would not be content to be just another imitator. It's often been said that Final Fantasy was inspired by Dragon Quest, but this is not exactly right. While it is true that the game was one of many that followed in the wake of Dragon Quest's success, it wasn't cast in the same mold. Instead, Square's RPG would draw from the same source as Dragon Quest did: the titans of 1980s Western computer role-playing games, Ultima and Wizardry. Wizardry in particular was extremely popular in Japan, to an extent that, at the time, shocked Western game journalists. In an article from the August 1988 issue of Computer Play magazine, it's claimed that game conventions devoted solely to Wizardry drew thousands of fans, and that Robert Woodhead, the game's creator, was honored as a rock star. This wouldn't be the first time Square attempted an RPG. Cruise Chaser Blasty, a highly innovative but ultimately ill-conceived sci-fi game where the player controlled a customizable mecha through lavishly animated space battles, and The Cursed Treasure of Cleopatra, a first-person adventure game set in modern-day Egypt, both featured turn-based combat, random encounters, and leveling up by gaining experience. But it was the first time they attempted to make the kind of epic, sprawling role-playing adventure that Sakaguchi, Tanaka, and many others like them had fallen in love with on the Apple II. While some companies saw the success of Dragon Quest as a chance to cash in on a growing trend, for Sakaguchi, Dragon Quest's success was a source of great frustration. For years, he had wanted to make his own epic role-playing game in the same vein as Ultima and Wizardry, but management at Square had no interest in such a product, reasoning that it wouldn't do well on a platform aimed primarily at kids. And even if it did get the go-ahead to create his dream game, Sakaguchi reasoned, how could he possibly make an adventure meant to be played over weeks, if not months, on a machine that couldn't even store data between sessions? To Sakaguchi and others at Square, the arrival of Dragon Quest felt like a punch to the gut. Not only had Koichi Nakamura and Yuji Horii found a way to translate the computer RPG experience onto the console format, but they had also solved the other issue. By using a simple password system to store and retrieve progress, Dragon Quest made it possible for players to embark on a days-long quest even on the Famicom. Copying down long strings of hiragana between sessions was a tedious process, and they had to pare the adventure down to the absolute bare bones to fit the data, but they had shown that it was possible. Although Dragon Quest had beaten them to the punch, Sakaguchi was determined to make the most of this opportunity. Over time, he had proven himself as a producer and director of a succession of moderately successful games, and as a result, he had been given increasingly large responsibilities within the company. Miyamoto knew business, but he knew next to nothing about game development. Sakaguchi, owing to his experience and stubborn personality, had become the only person who could say no to the big boss. And when Miyamoto established Square as an independent company in 1986, he appointed Sakaguchi as Director of Planning and Development. From the authority of this position, and with the backdrop of Dragon Quest selling millions of copies, Sakaguchi managed to convince Miyamoto that Square should try their hand at making their own full-scale RPG for the Famicom. Now that Sakaguchi finally had the green light to make the game of his dreams, all he had to do was assemble his team. The only problem was, not a lot of people at Square wanted to work with Sakaguchi. Hironobu Sakaguchi is often referred to as the father of Final Fantasy, and with good reason. Without his sure-handed guidance and tireless efforts, the series would not exist. But there are many unsung heroes who were also absolutely instrumental in the making of Final Fantasy. As part of Miyamoto's efforts to save the company, the employees that survived the drastic downsizing were divided into teams. There were about 4 of these at the time, with Sakaguchi heading the so-called A-team and Tanaka running the B-team. Each team leader would then hold presentations on the games they wanted to make, and employees could choose which team to join. But when Sakaguchi pitched his concept for the game that would become Final Fantasy, only 3 people volunteered to help. Meanwhile, Tanaka's team had 20 people. Sakaguchi knew he had only himself to blame. Although he had quickly risen within the ranks at the company, he had earned a reputation as a difficult person to work for. Say one thing for Sakaguchi, say he's tenacious. Knowing full well that he wouldn't be able to make anything close to the game he had in mind with just 4 people, he set about convincing others to join. Soon enough, he had a full team, including game designers Koichi Ishii and Akitoshi Kawazu, illustrator Katsuku Shibuya, who had joined Square as a graphic designer in 1986 after realizing that a career as an animator wasn't all it was cracked up to be, and composer Nobuo Uematsu, a self-taught musician who at this point had already scored nearly a dozen of Square's games. But perhaps the most important member to join the A-team was the man who would handle the crucial task of turning designs and ideas into actual code. He was a celebrity programmer whose name was already known across the industry, a person with no experience making RPGs or developing for the Famicom, and he wasn't even Japanese. In the 1980s, the name Nasir was legendary. Originally from Iran, Nasir Gebelli had made his fame in America with games like Space Eggs and Gorgon for the Apple II. He was considered a genius programmer and a gifted game developer, and seeing the text programmed by Nasir on the title screen served as a sort of badge of quality that indicated a game would be of a certain caliber. The exact details of just how Gebelli came into contact with Square differ depending on who you ask and when. But the gist of it seems to be that in 1986, Gebelli was looking for new challenges, and Square was looking for programmers. In Japan, where careers typically meant lifetime employment at a single company, programming was thought of as something of a fad, and Square and other companies had trouble finding talent who were looking to stay on for the long term. At some point, Masafumi Miyamoto met with Gebelli and offered him a job developing games for Square. Gebelli accepted. Development on Final Fantasy began sometime in early 1987. These were chaotic times, and Sakaguchi and his team were often running in parallel on multiple projects. This meant that some members of the A-team spent longer on the game than others. And the one who might have spent the most time on Final Fantasy is also the man who may well have had the greatest impact on shaping the title it would come to be. Game designer Koichi Ishii is probably best known as the creator of Seiken Densetsu, known as the Mana series in the West. But he also had a huge hand in the making of the original Final Fantasy. Ishii joined Square as a part-timer about 6 months before the project began, and for a long while he was the only person working on it. After bringing his team together, Sakaguchi set off to develop Highway Star, a racing game better known in North America as Rad Racer. In the meantime, he left Ishii with a task: come up with a plan for an RPG like Dragon Quest. Among the ideas Ishii came up with at this early stage were some that would form the very core of the experience. Side-view battles featuring monsters on one side and the heroes on the other. A story where the 4 classical elements, fire, earth, wind, and water, played a major role, and a diorama-style world map. Ishii also drew up plans for how the game would play out in broad strokes, sketched out the original designs for the 6 character jobs, and set up a rough outline for the game's interface. By the time the rest of the team were ready to join, Ishii already had much of the plan in place. Being inspired by the same crop of Western computer RPGs, Final Fantasy had a lot in common with Dragon Quest. But as much as Wizardry and Ultima informed the making of Final Fantasy, the single greatest influence on Square's RPG wasn't a video game. It goes further back than that, to the common ancestor of all role-playing games. The tabletop role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons was first published in 1974, and by the mid-80s it had become a worldwide phenomenon. At the time of Final Fantasy's development, Japanese-language editions of Dungeons & Dragons had made their way to the country's shores and found an eager audience among hardcore gamers, including one young man who would become a key member of Sakaguchi's A-team. Akitoshi Kawazu began his career as a game journalist, writing reviews for a magazine called Beep. But his true ambition wasn't to write about games, but to create them. This dream became a reality when he was hired by Square as a game designer. And when time came to start on Final Fantasy, it was Kawazu, an avid board game enthusiast and D&D player, who had the most knowledge about fantasy lore and RPGs. As a result, he was given the task of designing the game's battle system. While Kawazu could appreciate the pared-down, entry-level experience offered by the first 2 Dragon Quest games, he felt that these titles fell short of the possibilities offered in Western computer RPGs. As a designer, Kawazu would often draw inspiration from board games, and for Final Fantasy, he went straight to the source, setting himself a simple goal: to make a battle system that was as close to Dungeons & Dragons as possible. Some of the elements the game borrowed from D&D are obvious. Fighters, thieves, and monks, called black belts in the North American version, are classic role-playing archetypes. And even Final Fantasy's iconic spellcasters, the White Mage, Black Mage, and Red Mage, may have been a reference to Dragonlance, a popular Dungeons & Dragons campaign setting where wizards wore red, white, or black robes depending on their alignment. The magic system also borrowed heavily from Dungeons & Dragons. Instead of using MP as a resource for spellcasting, Final Fantasy went for a setup with spell charges separated into different tiers. A system of magic sometimes called Vancian magic, since its inclusion in Dungeons & Dragons was taken directly from the wild and wonderful Dying Earth stories by Jack Vance. The majority of the game's spells are also lifted wholesale from D&D, though you wouldn't know it by looking at the North American translation. The spell Bane is a poison element attack that instantly kills enemies that succumb to its effect. Its Japanese name, written in katakana, is Kurauda, or Cloud, an abbreviation of Cloud Kill, a classic D&D spell that envelops your enemies in a poisonous fog. Other notable spells taken from the pages of the player's handbook are Haste, Hold Person, and Raise Dead. There's even a suite of power word spells, Stun, Blind, and Kill, faithfully implemented right down to the rule that the spell only succeeds if the target is at or below a certain threshold of hit points. Many iconic D&D weapons also feature as rare treasure in Final Fantasy's dungeons, including the Ice Brand, the Sunblade, and the Defender. But the most obvious inspiration isn't the monsters you fight. At the time of Final Fantasy's release, what was then known as Advanced Dungeons & Dragons had 3 main compendiums of monsters for use with the game: the Monster Manual, the Monster Manual 2, and the Fiend Folio. And if you lay these books out side by side, you've pretty much got the entire roster of monsters from Final Fantasy in front of you. The Warriors of Light battle Ankheggs, Otyughs, Sahagins, Ochre Jellies, and Purple Worms. They take on Rakshasas, Mind Flayers, Carrion Crawlers, and Bullets. And of course they fight dragons. White, green, blue, and red, nearly the full set of D&D's iconic chromatic dragons, with only the black dragon left out from the original version of the game. In some cases, the inspirations were so obvious, the translation team had to work overtime to protect Nintendo of America from a potential lawsuit. There's one particular enemy called I in the North American version, and if you're an avid D&D player, you can probably kind of see what they were going for. Now take a look at the original Japanese version, where the same monster was called Beholder. Even Final Fantasy's 4 elemental fiends are drawn from the pages of the Monster Manual: Lich, Merilith, Kraken, and Tiamat. In fact, the number of monsters in the game that do not come from Dungeons & Dragons can be counted on the fingers of one hand. Of course, none of this is meant as a criticism. As a fan of both Final Fantasy and Dungeons & Dragons since the early 90s, I find this connection absolutely fascinating. And it's also in line with the spirit of D&D, which itself borrowed heavily from pre-existing sources. Vancian magic, the Paladin, and the Displacer Beast, these were only a few of countless ideas Dungeons & Dragons took from the pages of speculative fiction. So it only makes sense that Final Fantasy would follow in the same footsteps. Over time, the series would absorb more and more influences from a variety of sources, until the sum of its parts made for a truly unique whole. And even from the beginning, Final Fantasy went to great lengths to set itself apart from the industry standard pioneered by Dragon Quest. Before we go any further, let me just say that this video is about the original version of Final Fantasy for the Nintendo Famicom. There's been a lot of remakes of this game over the years, and they've all made some pretty major changes to the fundamental gameplay. So if you're familiar with a later version of Final Fantasy, some of the issues I talk about might sound a bit strange. Also, I'll be using the names of characters, locations, and items from the original NES translation. Mostly, anyway. What really set Final Fantasy apart from Dragon Quest and its many clones was its user interface. Where Dragon Quest went for a menu-based approach, where even simple interactions with your environment, such as talking to an NPC, opening a door, or even using a set of stairs, required you to navigate a menu and select the right option, Final Fantasy introduced context-sensitive controls. Doors open automatically when you try to walk through them, assuming they're not locked, and pressing the A button lets you talk to NPCs, open chests, or examine special tiles depending on what you're facing. The result is an interface that feels a lot more streamlined and honestly more modern than the early Dragon Quest titles. It also runs a lot better. The controls are crisp and the scrolling is silky smooth, which makes navigating the river maze's many twists and turns or the pitfalls of the ice cave feel pixel perfect. But there are a couple of weak spots. Having to wait for the dialogue box to render when you talk to NPCs can get a bit tiresome, and attempting to interact with something that isn't there results in a slow and tedious message telling you there's nothing to see. And while you don't need to hop into the game's menus to do every little thing, when you do have to, it's a little bit clunky. The transition from field to menu goes through a rainbow animation that really slows things down. And this is especially bad since Final Fantasy actually has 2 separate menus. There's the one you open with a start button, which handles character attributes, equipment, and spells. And then there's the select button menu, where you configure the party's marching order. And because of certain quirks in the game's design, you'll be bouncing back and forth between the 2 menus quite a bit. Once you are in the menus though, things run pretty smooth. Managing weapons and armor is super convenient since the whole party's equipment is displayed on a single page, making it very easy to get an overview of what everyone's using or swap things around. Although you can't see any info about what stats a piece of equipment has or who can use it, so you'll have to rely on trial and error to figure things out. Or, as the developers intended, check the game's manual. Inventory management is also pretty lenient compared to other RPGs of the time. Sure, weapons and armor go into the character's personal inventories, which are limited to 4 pieces of armor and 4 weapons each. But potions and key items go in a shared inventory with unlimited space, which is a pretty big deal, especially given how many healing potions you'll have to stock to get through the game's dungeons. On the other hand, using those items can be quite a drag. Each time you drink a potion, you're sent back to the item menu, so you'll have to spam a lot of buttons to fully heal up after taking a bunch of damage, or having your entire party afflicted with poison. Buying potions is also a real pain, because you can only buy one item at a time. In a process that involves multiple button presses, stocking up on healing potions can take 3 or 4 minutes. It might seem like a nitpick, but it's not at all unusual to have to buy 60 or 70 potions in order to refill your inventory after completing a dungeon. In fact, the shop interface is probably one of the clunkiest parts of the whole experience. You cannot see which weapons or armor you have equipped, so you have to be careful not to sell the wrong thing. Equipment for sale also doesn't provide any in-game stats, so you'll have to refer to the manual for that too. And the same goes for spells. You can't see what it does, who can use it, or who already has it. Another low-key annoying thing is the soundtrack. Every time you open up the menu, the background music gets interrupted by a special menu theme. This track is probably the weakest of all the game's compositions, and having to listen to the same starting notes over and over as you hop in and out of the menu makes for a very choppy experience. Which is kind of a shame, because Final Fantasy has one of the best soundtracks of the 8-bit era, and it came courtesy of one of the all-time greats. Someone who, in all honesty, may have contributed more to the success of the Final Fantasy series as a whole than any other individual person. Over the span of almost 40 years, the Final Fantasy series has gone through tremendous leaps of innovation, dizzying changes to gameplay, and many different art directions. The one constant has been the music. While many talented composers have contributed to the body of work that is the collected Final Fantasy soundscape, the series' musical triumphs owe most of its legacy to one man. Like many people involved in video game development in the 1980s, Nobuo Uematsu came into the industry almost by accident. Born in 1959, Uematsu is a musical prodigy who never received any classical training but taught himself how to play and compose music by picking up instruments and experimenting. Around 1985, Uematsu was living in Yokohama and working at a cassette rental shop, a place where people went to rent music on tape back in the dark ages before streaming, MP3s, or even CDs were really a thing. Meanwhile, Uematsu would make daily demo tapes and send them to record companies, but as an amateur without any formal training or industry connections, he found it hard to make any progress. At night, Uematsu would go out drinking with a group of other young creatives, and this is where he met a woman who worked at Square. Through that connection, he was introduced to Sakaguchi, who offered him a job composing music for the company's games. But Final Fantasy was far from Uematsu's first project at Square. Rather than being assigned to any one team, Uematsu took on whatever composing jobs were needed. By the time his work on Final Fantasy began, he had already completed the soundtracks for more than 10 different titles released by Square, all in the span of a single year. Composing music for the Famicom could be a grueling task. The 8-bit console's primitive sound chip could only play 3 notes at the same time, and that included sound effects as well as music. Not to mention that the composer would have to write the individual notes directly into the code. But Uematsu, who felt fortunate just to be able to make money composing any kind of music at all, embraced the challenge. He saw the limitations of the hardware as a kind of puzzle to solve, and experimented with techniques like shifting the frequencies of notes to create a sound with more depth. and he later credited these early beginnings with helping to shape his basic composition style of using strong melodies to build his music around. While Final Fantasy is arguably his weakest entry in the series, Uematsu is still Uematsu, and there's a lot to love here. The classic victory fanfare, the battle theme, and the town theme are all excellent compositions, and the Final Fantasy main theme, also known as Prologue, is one of the most iconic tracks in video game history. But my favorite piece has got to be Matoya's Cave, a composition so good it defies the Famicom's limits. The mushroomery and arrangement of this track by Yukiko Takada and Masayoshi Soken for the Heavensward expansion is one of my favorite tracks from all of Final Fantasy XIV, and that's saying like a lot. While Sakaguchi and Uematsu later established a close collaboration based on a foundation of deep trust, with Sakaguchi taking a very hands-off approach to the soundtracks of later titles, their work on Final Fantasy had some very interesting hiccups. When Uematsu first presented the completed music to Sakaguchi, the director rejected it out of hand, saying it was no good at all. Uematsu, presumably a staunch believer in his own work, resolved to try a trick. He went away and reprogrammed the order of the songs, then presented the same tracks to Sakaguchi again, but reshuffled. This time, Sakaguchi approved them right away. Another interesting incident happened near the end of development. Just as they were pretty much ready to ship the game, and Uematsu thought his work was done, Sakaguchi suddenly burst into the room and told him he needed one more track, a piece of music that would play on the opening screen. Pressed for time, Sakaguchi gave the composer a deadline of 30 minutes and told him to make the track right then and there in front of him. Not to be put out, Uematsu had a burst of inspiration, and in less than 10 minutes, he threw together a simple arpeggio and presented it to the director. This is the story of the creation of Prelude, the definitive piece of music and leitmotif of the entire Final Fantasy series, thrown together in less time than you really ought to spend drinking a cup of coffee under duress at the last moment. The work of a true genius. But the recruitment of Uematsu wasn't the only stroke of good luck that contributed to Final Fantasy's success. The project also got a serious boost from the participation of another creative mastermind. Although Dragon Quest had helped to open the door for Final Fantasy to even see the light of day, it wasn't really the kind of game Sakaguchi and his team wanted to make. Part of Dragon Quest's appeal was its mission statement, an entry-level RPG targeted firmly at kids. It had a lenient gameplay loop without the possibility of a true game over, a bright and colorful world, a story that was lighthearted and familiar with an upbeat and energizing soundtrack, and even the enemies you fought were more fun and cute than menacing. For Final Fantasy, Sakaguchi wanted something a bit more adult, with a darker tone. A world beleaguered by chaos, where brave heroes sojourned through desolate lands ruled by dreadful monsters. A key factor of Dragon Quest's success was the contributions of the legendary mangaka Akira Toriyama. Toriyama, already a major star at the time, provided character designs and box art that perfectly captured the game's essence and greatly resonated with its intended audience of manga-hungry Japanese kids. Sakaguchi knew that he too needed an artist capable of evoking the world that existed inside of the minds of him and his team. And as it happens, he ended up getting the perfect man for the job. But it only happened through a rather bizarre coincidence. As with many things about Final Fantasy, it all started with Koichi Ishii. Ishii wanted to create a fantasy world in digital form, a world where spirits and supernatural beings felt close by. And one of his chief inspirations was the work of an artist by the name of Yoshitaka Amano. Amano had gained fame as a member of Tatsunoko Productions, an animation studio known for popular series like Speed Racer, Gatchaman and Tekkaman, and later rose to prominence as the illustrator and character designer of author Hideyuki Kikuchi's Vampire Hunter D novels, which were catapulted into the mainstream through a 1985 anime adaptation where Amano also provided designs. Ishii felt that Amano's unique juxtaposition of ethereal beauty and stark menace would be perfect for their vision of what Final Fantasy should be, so he went to Sakaguchi to pitch the artist as a potential collaborator. Sakaguchi, however, was not convinced. He'd never heard of Amano, and he wasn't sure whether the artist would be the right fit. But by some combination of luck, fate, or sheer coincidence, about a week later, Sakaguchi himself approached Ishii to ask his opinion on an illustration he'd found that he thought might fit. Ishii couldn't believe his eyes. The illustration Sakaguchi had shown him was by none other than Yoshitaka Amano. Having somehow independently arrived at the same conclusion, Sakaguchi and Ishii were now committed to securing the artist's involvement in their project. Since Amano's office happened to be in Yokohama, Sakaguchi, Ishii, and Kazuko Shibuya piled into Sakaguchi's sports car and went to make their proposal in person. Their timing couldn't have been better. Having felt stifled by his job designing characters for animations, Amano had only recently become an independent illustrator and was looking for interesting new challenges. He knew very little about video games, but he felt intensely motivated by the prospect of working with fantasy. He readily agreed. While Amano's work was exceptionally difficult to translate into the simplistic medium of 8-bit graphics, his concept art greatly influenced and guided the game's visual style. Amano's take on the familiar Dungeons & Dragons monsters was fresh and striking. Drawing on his experience from animation, Amano worked with distinct poses and silhouettes, ensuring that his designs would stand out in spite of the Famicom's limitations in color and resolution. Shibuya especially spent a crazy amount of time studying Amano's art style, painstakingly adding as much of his unique character as she could into the game. Amano's vision for Final Fantasy was starkly different from Toriyama's work in Dragon Quest. The Tyrannosaurus looks like something out of the pages of an H.R. Geiger art book. The Rakshasa leaps from the screen with all the ferocity of a mortal foe, and the troll clutches its skull in insane rage, ready to rend anyone foolish enough to disturb it limb from limb. But one monster in particular embodies the difference in tone between Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy: the slime. Dragon Quest's cuddly, teardrop-shaped smiley face looks so endearing, it's become the mascot of the entire franchise, and one of the most recognizable icons in video game history. Final Fantasy's slime is a horrifying monster that droops from the ceiling to dissolve your bones. Amano's style was the perfect fit for Final Fantasy, and his cover art, depicting the Warrior of Light and Princess Sarah, stood out among other Famicom games on the shelf, making the box look one of a kind. But it wasn't just the cover that made a good impression. For all that the graphics look old and primitive today, back in 1987, Final Fantasy was a great-looking game. For the first decade of its existence, the Final Fantasy franchise languished in the enormous shadow cast by Dragon Quest, at least on the Japanese market. But even though Square saw themselves as underdogs, they always felt they could beat their rival in one area: graphics. Drawing on their expertise from creating graphical novel-style adventure games such as the Death Trap, Alpha, and the Crystal Dragon, Square were able to put out some pretty impressive visuals for their RPG. Towns and dungeons stretched the limited color palette through the use of shading and perspective to make every environment feel more immersive. The overworld shows gently curving coastlines, dense forests that engulf the heroes as they travel through them, and expansive settlements that take up considerable real estate on the world map, far beyond the primitive icons of games like Dragon Quest or even Ultima 4. Combat especially looked super cool for its time. While most of Final Fantasy's competitors adopted the style of combat popularized by Wizardry, a first-person view that displayed the enemy in front of you on the screen, Square's RPG went with a side view perspective, showing monsters and heroes both on separate sides of the screen. Weapon attacks are animated, and spell effects resolve visually on the screen, evoking the feel of an action scene playing out before your eyes. This approach may have been inspired by Square's own Cruise Chaser Blasty, in which the battle screen was split between the players and the enemy's mecha as they duked it out in animated battles. The action was also embellished by Katsuko Shibuya's inspired character sprites, which possess a kind of old-school cool that holds up well even today. The Famicom's sprite-based graphics proved a good fit, allowing the team to make some highly efficient design choices. Characters are displayed by lining up 8x8 pixel blocks, and while field sprites are shown using a 2x2 block formation, the ones used in battle take up 3 vertical and 2 horizontal blocks. This block-based approach allowed the devs to animate individual parts of a character, such as only the hands or the feet, reducing the need to store multiple versions of the same character. To save even more space, the devs only made the left-facing version of the field sprites, then took advantage of the Famicom's ability to mirror sprites in order to show the characters moving in the opposite direction. Likewise, for the up and down facing field sprites, only a single frame of animation was stored and then mirrored to make it seem like the arms and legs were moving. Such clever tactics were typical of a time when cartridge space came at a massive premium, and only goes to show that a game like Final Fantasy was already stretching the limits of the console hardware at the time. Battles are also enriched by the amazing variety of monsters. Even if you ignore all the palette swaps in the game, Final Fantasy still offered an impressive number of enemies to fight. Out of a total of 123 monsters you can face in this game, there are no less than 57 unique enemy sprites. 7 more than in Dragon Quest III, which came out a couple of months later, and well ahead of the second Dragon Quest, which featured only 36 unique monster designs. The most impressive examples are definitely Chaos and the 4 Fiends, each of which takes up the entire field. Such detailed illustrations were made possible by the fact that they indeed appeared alone, while ordinary monsters were limited to a maximum of 3 colors plus black. Boss monsters that hogged the whole battlefield had access to a palette of up to 6 colors each. While the game's battle scenes didn't have backgrounds in the sense we think of them today, Final Fantasy managed a pretty cool compromise. By applying a banner across the top of the battlefield, the feel and mood of a given setting could be approximated through the suggestion of a wall at the back of the scene, allowing the player to get their head in the right mind space. There are 16 different backgrounds used to represent different environments, including plains, rivers, forests, and deserts, as well as some more unique locations like the Waterfall Cave, the Sunken Shrine, and the Mirage Tower. And these minimalist backgrounds go a long way towards getting you into the spirit of the scene. In spite of the primitive hardware, Final Fantasy's graphics added a lot to the gameplay experience. And the team's commitment to strong visuals also carried over into another aspect of the game, the story. Because there's one critical scene in particular that greatly benefited from a visual component. Final Fantasy takes place in a world beset by evil. For centuries, the land has been tormented by the 4 Fiends, whose corruptive power has stolen the light from the elemental crystals. This has caused the wind to die, the seas to rage, and the earth to rot, and has blanketed the land in a horde of monsters. The heroes are the Warriors of Light, 4 young orphans prophesied to deliver the world from evil by restoring light to the darkened elemental crystals. Throughout their quest, the Warriors of Light journey far and wide, braving monster-infested dungeons to find and defeat the 4 Fiends. In the end, their quest will take them beyond the boundaries of the world and beyond time itself. Sakaguchi came up with the basic concept, but he felt he needed help developing the detailed plot. It wasn't enough for the game to have a story, he wanted to make a game that would touch people's hearts. For that, he needed the services of a professional writer. And as it happens, someone at Square had gone to high school with a potential candidate. Kenji Terada was a freelance writer who had previously worked as an assistant to Osamu Tezuka, revolutionary creator of Astro Boy and sometimes called the father of manga. In the 80s, Terada had gone on to become a freelance writer and director, and worked with numerous anime including Space Cobra, Cat's Eye, and Silver Fang. Sakaguchi met with Terada to deliver his pitch, explaining that he wanted to make a game that would make people cry. Though intrigued by the challenge, Terada remained unsure. He had no experience whatsoever with video games, and wasn't sure the medium could convey the kinds of emotions Sakaguchi was going for. But once he started to work with the team, he found their enthusiasm intoxicating, and started to believe there was potential for the video game medium to convey a cinematic emotional experience. In a time when hiring a professional writer to work on a video game was almost unheard of, the recruitment of Terada sent a clear message. Final Fantasy meant to tell an epic tale. While there are no characters to speak of and the plot structure mostly resembles a long string of fetch quests, the story was full of twists and turns. Ousting a pack of pirates that had taken a town hostage, reviving an elven prince from his magical slumber, and delivering a devastated village from a predatory vampire. There were also a number of keystone moments that were truly memorable, like stumbling over a colony of mermaids in the middle of an underwater dungeon, or taking to the skies in the airship for the first time. And though the realization that the king of the Western Keep is actually the Dark Elf in disguise might seem like an obvious twist now, it was actually a pretty cool subversion of a common trope back then. The game's world building was also leagues better than the competition. Locations like the Temple of Fiends and the Sunken Shrine tell a silent story about the distant past. The isolated people of Lufane speak a long-forgotten language that must be deciphered before you can learn their secrets. And beyond the sky, an ancient space station stands silent vigil over a world that no longer remembers it, while the fiend that decimated its former masters makes a roost out of its halls of silicon and steel. Even the game's big dumb plot twist, the revelation that the world is stuck in a time loop created when Garland was somehow sent 2000 years into the past after being defeated by the heroes, speaks to the game's lofty ambitions. It lacks foreshadowing and makes no kind of sense, but it feels right at home in a franchise infamous for its overly complicated, sometimes downright incomprehensible stories. But the most striking way in which this game conveyed its narrative ambitions was in how the story began. To signal that this would not be your typical save the princess setup that was common in Famicom titles of the time, Final Fantasy had you rescuing Princess Sarah in the prologue. And if you still had any doubts that this would be something extraordinary, they would have been blown away by what happened next. Unlike most games of its time, Final Fantasy does not present a title screen when you boot it up. Instead, following a text scroll that lays out the backstory, you're thrown right into the thick of the action. The real story only begins once the heroes cross the bridge departing Corneria, and as the prologue comes to an end, we get the game's true intro. Drawn by Kazuko Shibuya, the pixel art that shows the four Warriors of Light looking back at the castle has become one of the most iconic, enduring motifs of the Final Fantasy franchise. It's the first time we see the Final Fantasy logo, the first time we hear the Final Fantasy main theme, and it's also one of the earliest examples of a credit roll in a video game. But the coolest thing is how this initial sequence serves Final Fantasy's gameplay, because the prologue doesn't just set the stage for the story, it also teaches the player how to play the game. For a Famicom game of the time, Final Fantasy's world was absolutely enormous. And since many of the kids who sat down with the game would have never played an RPG before, the amount of freedom it offered must have seemed astounding. So it's only natural that they need a bit of guidance. Like most games from this era, Final Fantasy doesn't have a whole lot of in-game instructions. Items have no tooltips to indicate their properties, spells have no descriptions, and you don't get any help when forming your party. And there's certainly no tutorial section or help menu to refer to when you get stuck. Welcome to gaming in the 1980s. Back then, you weren't expected to just charge into a game unprepared. game cartridges were already jam-packed with code, music, graphics and story, so there wasn't any space left over to devote to instructions. Instead, video games were sold with physical manuals that contained everything you needed to know about how to play, and the one included with Final Fantasy was thicker than most. The manual that came with the North American version is called the Explorer's Handbook, and it's 80 pages long. So much of how to play the game is explained in these pages. It shows you how to form an effective party, how to conquer your foes in battle, and how to outfit your characters and keep them alive. But the Explorer's Handbook goes far beyond the basics. A lot of the manual is devoted to a step-by-step walkthrough that covers the first half of the story, including what places to go and what bosses you'll be fighting along the way. There's also a fold-out map of the world with every location marked, a bestiary with the exact stats of every monster in the game, visual guides for several dungeons, and a detailed chart of every spell, weapon, and piece of armor. The expectation was that you'd read the manual before starting the game and then refer to it constantly throughout the adventure. Pretty much any question that might come up would be answered by the Explorer's Handbook. But as helpful as this information is, once you've gotten the hang of the basics, you don't necessarily need a lot of it, because the game itself has a pretty clever way to teach you the ropes, through what I would describe as a hidden in-game tutorial. Final Fantasy is a huge adventure, but to avoid overwhelming new players, it starts small. Once you've created your party, the game drops you off outside the castle town of Corneria. From this moment on, you're on your own. But right from the start, Final Fantasy demonstrates its core gameplay loop in a very intuitive way. In the beginning, you only have access to Corneria and its immediate surroundings, including the Temple of Fiends. By restricting the player to a limited area, the game ensures that new players can't stray too far from safety before they find their feet. There's a town where you can rest, save your game, and buy stuff. Walking around outside the town results in random encounters, and the further you go from the starting point, the stronger the monsters get. All important lessons to learn. As you hang around town, you'll start to see that talking to NPCs will get you a lot of useful info, which is how you'll learn about Princess Sarah, the fallen knight Garland, and the Temple of Fiends. The path through the wilderness gives you your first real taste of adventure, and enemies get tougher still when you enter the temple, which also serves as a practical tutorial on dungeon crawling. A simple layout with some optional treasure, locked doors you'll have to come back for later to show you that the world is bigger than you might think, and an exciting duel against Garland to cap it all off, which teaches you that dungeons often have a powerful monster at the end, so you'd better make sure you're ready. The simple structure of the Temple of Fiends and the placement of Garland in the dungeon is a fairly genius design decision, especially for an entry-level RPG. You don't have to level up much to beat him, but if it's the first thing you try when the game starts up, you'll probably get your butt kicked, which teaches you an important lesson about making proper preparations. But since the temple is super small and the path to the boss is just a straight shot down a short corridor, you won't have wasted a lot of your time in learning this lesson. And it is a crucial lesson to learn. If you're not strong enough to take on the challenges that come your way, you are going to lose. And unlike in Dragon Quest, losing in Final Fantasy means game over. With the original Dragon Quest, designer Yuji Horii wanted to invite his players into a warm, welcoming world. The game could be challenging, sure, but even if you fell in battle, you'd just respawn back at the king with all of your progress intact, except for losing half your gold as a sort of penalty. Horii's adventure had no game over screen, so no matter how poorly you did, the longer you played, the stronger you got. Final Fantasy is a much less forgiving game. Sakaguchi wanted his RPG to be dark and foreboding, to capture the feeling of setting out on an epic journey through a hostile world where monsters and foul magic held sway. And the game's design embodies this philosophy. Random encounters are frequent and unpredictable. Surprise attacks can be absolutely devastating. Many enemies inflict dangerous status effects such as stun, petrification, or instant death. And dungeons usually have a powerful boss monster waiting for you at the end. Unless you're exceptionally well prepared, you're going to die a lot. and dying in Final Fantasy means getting sent all the way back to the title screen. To soften the blow, the dev team ensured that players would have plenty of opportunities to lock down their progress. And the way they solved this is so glaringly obvious to us today, you'd be forgiven for thinking it's not even worth mentioning. But when Final Fantasy first came out, it was a pretty huge deal. Unlike a modern system, early generations of video game consoles like the Famicom didn't have a hard drive, so any data the game wanted to write had to be stored on the cartridge itself. Which was a bit of a problem, since the cartridges of the time didn't have any rewritable memory that would remain after the console was powered off. Many Famicom games were short enough that this wasn't an issue. You'd simply start a new game from scratch each time you played, and part of the challenge was to reach the end before your bedtime. But Final Fantasy was far too large an adventure to be completed in a single sitting. You were expected to spend days, if not weeks, before beating the game. As mentioned earlier, Dragon Quest had gotten around this issue by using a password system. But by the time of the second game, it was starting to show its limitations. With all the new features and a much larger scope, players would now have to write down up to 52 characters to record their progress. Unless something changed, it looked like console RPGs might have reached the limits of their potential. But by late 1987, the Famicom had something much better to offer. A tiny little battery that would change everything. By including a static random access memory or SRAM chip powered by a button cell inside the cartridge, player data could now be stored between sessions, even when the power was switched off. Many people point to The Legend of Zelda as being the first title to use this solution, but that's only true for the North American market. In Japan, the game had been released for the Famicom Disk System, which used a disk-based storage to deliver its games. The first cartridge game that used battery-powered SRAM seems to have been Morita Shogi, a Japanese chess game released on April 14, 1987. When Final Fantasy launched on December 18 of the same year, it became one of the first 10 games for the Famicom to include a battery-powered save feature. And it might have given Sakaguchi some pleasure to know that they did it before Dragon Quest, if only by a slim margin. Players could now save their game at any of the world's towns by visiting the local inn. Better yet, you could even do so on the world map, as long as you had a tent, cabin or house, items sold at most of the game's shops. But even more important is the content this hardware made possible. Without its battery-powered SRAM, Final Fantasy would have probably been a much more modest title. It likely wouldn't have been able to offer a party of 4 characters chosen from 6 different jobs, allow spellcasters to learn up to 24 spells, or provide space for each hero to carry 8 pieces of equipment drawn from a list of near 100 options. Not to mention keep track of which among hundreds of treasure chests the party had looted. That said, there was a limit. There was only room for a single quest to be stored on each cartridge, which meant that if your brother or sister wanted to play too, you were in for some heated arguments. Battery-powered SRAM allowed Final Fantasy to do things that hadn't been done before, but the game also borrowed heavily from contemporary titles, including one of the most influential games of all time, The Legend of Zelda. In later years, the Final Fantasy series has followed a genre trend towards more linear gameplay, where player choice has increasingly taken a backseat to intricate character-driven narratives. In return, Japanese RPGs have placed a stronger focus on the more mechanical RPG elements, like equipment management and menu grinding. And in some sense, this was true even with the first game. In gaming, we often talk about the critical path, the shortest, most direct route from beginning to end, ignoring all sidetracks and optional content. The original Dragon Quest had an extremely short critical path. Aside from a bare handful of locations on the map, the player could explore the entire world right from the start, provided they were strong enough to survive the journey. But that's not really true of Final Fantasy. We've already talked about the game's hidden tutorial, which restricts the player to the immediate area surrounding Cuneria until you clear the Temple of Fiends. After you defeat Garland and rescue Princess Sarah, the king orders the construction of a bridge that allows access to a larger section of the world, including Matoya's cave and the town of Pravoka. But this is just the first in a series of similar choke points. After defeating the pirate captain Bicke in Pravoka, the heroes get their hands on a ship, which lets them sail on the Aldean Sea. Completing a string of fetch quests around Elfland rewards the heroes with the TNT, which the dwarf Nerik uses to blow open a canal that connects the Aldean Sea with the wider ocean. And after finishing another chain of quests and defeating Lich, the heroes can visit Crescent Lake and retrieve the canoe, which can navigate the world's rivers. Finally, in the depths of the Ice Cave, you'll find the Floater, which allows you to raise an ancient airship from its resting place beneath the sands, after which the entire world lies open before you. By designing the game's overworld around a series of choke points, Final Fantasy forgoes complete player freedom in favor of a stronger sense of progression. The way the world opens up step by step with the ship, canoe and airship gives a feeling of liberation that's rare to find even today, at least in the JRPG genre. Because the game's world design has a lot in common with what we'd expect to see in a Metroidvania title. Metroidvanias feature intricate worlds where many areas and rewards are initially off limits and can be accessed only after the player gets their hands on certain tools, weapons or abilities, which usually also unlock shortcuts that add a sense of interconnectedness and reduce the need for backtracking. And this is exactly how Final Fantasy is designed. Getting the ship opens up the inner sea and the southern side of the main continent, but it also provides shortcuts back to Corneria and Matoya's cave. Blowing open the canal with the TNT gives access to the Melmond subcontinent and Crescent Lake, but it also lets you circle the main continent and approach it from different angles. And getting the Mystic Key encourages you to do a tour of past locations to claim a bunch of treasure you couldn't reach before. But the most striking example of Metroidvania design in Final Fantasy is not the sailing ship or the Mystic Key or even the airship. It's actually the canoe. The canoe completely changes the way you interact with the world, giving you options for how to approach different areas and opening up shortcuts all over the place. And I especially love how cleverly this benefit is demonstrated by the town of Crescent Lake itself. The settlement is surrounded by snaking rivers that force a massive detour in order to reach your destination. But once you have the canoe, you can simply cross the water in a straight line. Not to mention that you can now dock the ship at the nearby river, instead of making the long journey from the port at the eastern tip of the continent. Textbook Metroidvania stuff. Of course, Square's world design wasn't actually inspired by Metroidvanias. The genre didn't even exist back in those days, though there were games that had these elements, including, naturally, the original Metroid from the year before. Rather, Koichi Ishii has stated that one of his primary inspirations when laying down the fundamental structure for Final Fantasy was The Legend of Zelda, which of course also featured this design philosophy from its earliest inception. And there's a nice symmetry to that. The Metroidvania genre was first coined in the early 2000s to describe a style of gameplay that was famously adopted by the Castlevania series, starting with Symphony of the Night. But Castlevania didn't get this idea from Metroid, it got it from The Legend of Zelda. The emphasis on key items that open up new parts of the world wasn't the only bit of inspiration Final Fantasy took from The Legend of Zelda. It also borrowed a crucial component of how the quest was structured. Because even though the steps you have to take to complete the game are mostly linear, there's actually a lot of freedom in how you go about them. When you look at the structure of Final Fantasy's main quest with a critical eye, there are some things that could have been done better. You get the sailing ship very early, so taking to the sea doesn't feel like much of a milestone. The whole questline to get the TNT seems needlessly complicated and involves a ton of backtracking. And it would have been really cool if the 4 crystals gave you some kind of boon when you defeat the respective fiend. It's just a little underwhelming to hit a major milestone without getting any real reward. But the biggest issue with Final Fantasy's quest design is the severe lack of balance between what's mandatory and what's not. The linear nature of most JRPGs is usually mitigated by vast amounts of optional content. This gives a large degree of freedom back to the player by letting you set your own pace through the story and makes repeated playthroughs a lot more interesting. But that's not the case in Final Fantasy, because almost nothing in this game is optional. There's just over 20 locations in Final Fantasy's world, but only 2 of them can be skipped on the way to the final battle. The Cardia Caves, which are home to Bahamut, the King of Dragons, and Castle Ordeals, which you must clear to win Bahamut's favor, earning the heroes a transformation into the more advanced version of their respective jobs. And since few players would willingly skip this step, even these 2 places are pretty much essential. Every other location in the game has to be visited at least once to finish the story. The town of Melmond is home to Dr. Oni, whose help you need to decipher the Lufenian language. The remote village of Gaia is where you free the bottle fairy, giving you the key item you need to access the sunken shrine. And the waterfall cave hides the cube that allows you to reach the floating castle. The list goes on. As large as Final Fantasy's world is, some areas can feel a little bit empty. And there are definitely points in the adventure where an optional location could have done a lot of good. A dungeon near Pravokia with some decent gear and a nice bit of cash would have made the transition to Elfheim a lot smoother. And an island temple that's visible off the coast while making your way to the Marsh Cave would have given you something to look forward to when you finally reach the high seas. But even though the steps you have to take along the path are fixed, Final Fantasy still offers a lot of freedom. Square may not have been able to fit as much optional content into the game as they probably wanted to, but they did something that might have been even better. They gave you a lot of leeway in how you tackle the quest. Because the quest is structured using choke points, there are several places in the game where you can freely choose how you want to proceed. Once you get the canoe, you can do the next 3 dungeons in any order: the Ice Cave, Gurgo Volcano, and Castle Ordeals. Sure, you won't be able to do the job upgrade before you have the airship, but the castle still has some awesome treasure that's well worth an early visit. And while Lich has to be defeated before you can get the canoe, you can actually do the remaining 3 fiends in any order you like. On my first playthrough, I followed a fairly predictable route, tackling the 4 fiends in what's more or less the intended order: Earth, Fire, Water, and Wind. On subsequent playthroughs, I've mixed it up. I like to do Castle Ordeals before I have the airship, just to get the Heal Staff and Zeus Gauntlet as soon as possible. And on this most recent attempt, I challenged myself to do a reverse order. First the Ice Cave to get the airship, a quick detour into the Sunken Shrine to get the slab, then straight to the floating castle to defeat Tiamat. Back to the Sunken Shrine to finish Kraken, and then finally onto the volcano to take out Kerry. Doing the floating castle at such a low level made for some very tense moments, but the feeling of waltzing through Gurgo Volcano, one-shotting anything that didn't outright run from my party, felt like sweet revenge for how much trouble I had with this dungeon on my first playthrough. While the world of Final Fantasy doesn't offer quite the same feeling of sheer discovery as the early Dragon Quest titles, the sense of adventure is every bit as strong. And the feeling of soaring over Castle Corneria in the airship after spending so much of your journey trudging through monster-infested forests is hard to beat. Especially since so much of the game is spent fighting those monsters. If you've played a lot of turn-based RPGs, Final Fantasy's combat system will look very familiar. But there are a couple of major differences that are worth pointing out. The first is in how the game handles feedback. Rather than illustrating the outcome of spells and attacks through visual cues or bouncing numbers, Final Fantasy gives you all the information you need in the form of text. And each time you start up the game, you're asked to set the response speed, which determines how long this information stays on the screen before disappearing. As a beginner, you might be tempted to leave it on the default, but unless you're a primary school kid just learning to read, which may well have described a large portion of the game's target audience at the time, this is gonna feel unbearably slow. At the highest setting, combat flows a lot better, and this is how I prefer to play. but at this pace, the text flashes by so quick, it's hard to follow what you're actually being told. And while it doesn't really matter that much in the average battle, if you're new to this game, it can make it hard to understand the most confusing part of combat. As I mentioned earlier, Final Fantasy uses something called a phased combat system. Instead of issuing commands to individual characters and seeing their actions resolve immediately, Final Fantasy asks you to queue up the actions of all 4 heroes ahead of time. Heroes and monsters then take turns attacking, casting spells, or using items, and when everyone's had a chance to act, the process starts over. Popularized by the Wizardry series, phased combat was the gold standard for turn-based battles in the 1980s. But it's a bit of a departure from what we've come to expect today, and it does call for a different mindset when fighting monsters. Orders are issued before the round starts, and the turn order is completely random, so it's pretty much impossible to plan ahead. Allies that needed healing may have already been knocked out, spells you were hoping to prevent may have gone off, and most importantly, enemies you were targeting may have already been slain. When this happens, you might expect the character to switch their target to one of the remaining monsters. Not so in Final Fantasy. Instead, a character that targets a monster that's already dead will strike at the empty space, resulting in what's called an ineffective attack. Basically, you lose the action. This might seem like an oversight or maybe even a bug, but it's actually a deliberate design decision. Inspired by the early days of Dungeons & Dragons, phased combat was meant to simulate the frantic nature of real-time battles, where it was understood that all of these pre-selected actions were taking place at the same time. And in the midst of a chaotic melee, it was natural that some actions would misfire. It can certainly feel frustrating today, but the upside is that this design choice promotes tactical decision-making. Since you cannot be sure how many hits it will take to down an enemy or the order in which the characters will act, the key skill you need to learn to excel at this game is how to play the odds. The better you get at estimating how to spread your attacks between different enemies, the more damage you'll do, and the faster the battles will go. Which ironically means that player skill actually plays a bigger role than in some of the later games in this series. For its time, Final Fantasy's combat system provided an exceptional amount of strategic nuance. Careful targeting was crucial to minimize the damage you took and increase your staying power. The heroes could face up to 9 opponents in the same battle, and unlike in Dragon Quest, they could be individually targeted. Monsters came in more than 120 varieties, each with their own quirks and abilities, and, apparently a first in Japanese RPGs, elemental strengths and weaknesses. And there were dozens and dozens of weapons, armors, and spells to employ against these foes. Not to mention the 6 different jobs you could combine into your perfect party, giving you a ton of room for experimenting with different tactics for different enemy formations. That said, the system could have been better. The lack of a structured turn order that could be manipulated or at least predicted takes a lot away from the game's strategic depth. But the biggest problem is the lack of variety in the actions the characters can take. There are no special abilities, no option to take a defensive posture if you're close to dying, and healing potions are pretty much useless in the heat of battle. That just leaves magic, which is a bit of a problem, because spellcasting in Final Fantasy isn't nearly as reliable as it should be. At least, not the kind that comes from the characters. As I talked about before, one of the many elements Final Fantasy borrowed from Dungeons & Dragons was its system of spellcasting, or at least a version of it. This meant that instead of following the genre standard established by Dragon Quest, in which the heroes drew from a generic pool of magic points to cast their spells, Final Fantasy uses something I would call spell charges. Spells are organized into tiers from 1 to 8 according to their power level, and a spellcaster gets a certain number of spell charges for each tier. Casting a spell consumes 1 charge of the appropriate tier, and when you're out of charges, you cannot cast any more spells of the same tier, but you can still use spells from other tiers as long as you have charges left for them. Spellcasters start the game with access to first tier magic and only a couple of spell charges, but as they level up, they unlock higher tiers of magic and earn more spell charges of each tier. In theory, I actually really like the spell charge system. In many later Final Fantasy games, there's really no incentive to casting fire when you've already learned the more powerful Fyra. Less powerful spells cost less MP, but that rarely tends to matter, and the more powerful spells are usually so much stronger that the cost-benefit analysis tips easily in their favor. With a spell charge system, you have at least an incentive to make the best possible use of lower tier spells even later in the game, since they don't share a resource with higher tier spells, and that can lead to some really interesting decisions. In practice though, that's not how things pan out, because Final Fantasy's magic system sticks far too close to its D&D roots. Just like in Dungeons & Dragons, you never get more than 9 spell charges of any one tier, and even for tier 1 spells, you probably won't hit that cap until the very end of the game unless you do some serious power leveling. These numbers worked fine for D&D, where a party is expected to fight maybe a couple of times before resting, but in Final Fantasy you'll often have to go through 40 to 50 battles before you get a chance to recuperate. And in the original version, there's no way to restore spell charges in the middle of a dungeon. With only a handful of spells of each tier to cast, you just don't have enough to waste on the average random encounter. And while this does drive some interesting decisions about how to best spend your limited resources, having to be super stingy with magic means that combat can get kind of boring. Most of the time, you just end up attacking, even with your mages. Until, that is, you get your first sweet taste of true, repeatable magic. For the most part, equipment management in Final Fantasy is pretty straightforward. There's weapons to wield and armor to wear, and for about the first half of the game, it's really just about figuring out which of your characters can use what. But all that changes around the time you reach Castle Ordeals, because the castle is likely to be the first time you come into contact with one of Final Fantasy's coolest features. One of the ideas Akitoshi Kawadzu borrowed from wizardry was spellcasting items. These are weapons and armor that can be equipped as normal, but which can also be used in combat through the item command to invoke a specific spell without consuming the item. This is incredibly useful for 2 reasons. First, because it allows the character to cast a spell without consuming a spell charge. And second, because any character can use any spellcasting item, even if they cannot equip it. Spellcasting items are rare, and most are found quite late in the game, but when you do get them, they're a real game changer. Suddenly, you can afford to throw a bit of magic around whenever you feel like it. The Zeus Gauntlet's lightning spell works great against large groups of weaker foes, especially the water-based ones. The heal staff lets you top up your party's hit points whenever you can spare the action. And the Wizard Staff's Confuse spell can render some enemy formations completely helpless. And sure, spellcasting items might be a bit too strong in this game, but they're also incredibly fun. The feeling of popping the lid on a treasure chest and finding a new spellcasting item is like hitting the jackpot. And being able to spam a spell whenever you want is pretty darn intoxicating. Adding a couple of spellcasting items to your inventory makes combat more interesting, and random encounters more manageable, both of which are pretty big deals when you're trying to deal with the game's most hostile environments. Even by the standards of traditional Japanese RPGs, Final Fantasy's dungeons are very simple. There is a nice bit of variation to the environments, with everything from the insides of a volcano to a high-tech space station, and some dungeons have special challenges to deal with, such as lava flows or pits that drop you between floors. But there are no puzzles, special events, or story sequences to keep things interesting. And while there is a tiny bit of lore to see, like the mermaid colony in the sunken shrine, or the planetary viewport in the floating castle, these spots are few and far between. As much as Sakaguchi and his team tried to make Final Fantasy's dungeons as interesting as they could, it's still mostly a matter of pathfinding through a maze-like environment full of branching paths and dead ends, while searching for optional treasure and dealing with constant monster attacks. Getting through these dungeons is a test of endurance, but that also means that one of the fundamental principles of old school dungeon crawling very much applies. Not every random encounter is meant to be fought. Since the dawn of computer role-playing games, the ability to run from battle has been a staple of the genre, but the purpose and nature of this option has changed a great deal since those early days. In modern JRPGs, enemies usually have visual cues of some sort to indicate their relative power, more often than not in outright numbers. And since random encounters have become more or less obsolete, you pretty much always know when it's safe to engage. And even if you do get in way over your head, there's not much of a penalty for dying anyway. But Final Fantasy was inspired by games like Wizardry and The Bard's Tale, where a lot of the excitement sprang from the tension of an uncertain outcome. The whole point was to see how far you could push your luck before you turned back, and whether you would even make it out alive at all. Risk management was a huge part of the experience, not just in terms of the preparations you made before each run, but also in regards to the actions you took inside the dungeon. And the stakes were often high, since dying could mean losing a lot of progress. In Final Fantasy, not all random encounters are created equal. Some enemy formations are absolutely brutal, and since the number of enemies you'll face in each battle is highly varied, luck can play a big part. A single sorcerer can stun your whole party with trance, then pick them off one by one with instant death attacks. So coming up against 5 of them in the same battle gives you even odds for a party wipe. A group of 6 cockatrices are likely to turn your party to stone if you don't run the moment you see them. And getting ambushed by 3 frost dragons who all use their ice breath is guaranteed to end your run. None of this matters too much on the overworld. Tents are cheap, provide party-wide healing, and allow you to save your game at every other step if you're feeling anxious. But such items cannot be used in dungeons, so once you're inside, there's no way to record your progress or recover your spell charges until you make it out. Dungeons are long, healing is limited, and even if you make it all the way, you still have a powerful foe to face. Final Fantasy was one of the early titles that helped establish the genre convention that almost every dungeon should have a climactic boss encounter at the end. Epic enemies like the 4 Fiends put a real exclamation mark on the dungeon crawling experience, but knowing that you'll have to do the whole thing all over again if you should fall in battle adds a lot of tension to these fights. The reality is that a single stroke of bad luck can end a dungeon run, and this design philosophy comes to a head in the Floating Castle. The final approach to Tiamat's lair is a long bridge where you have a small but very real chance of running into the game's most powerful enemy by far, War Mech. And if you don't get to go first, you will probably die at the very last part of an hour-long dungeon, right before the boss, without any save point along the way. And there's nothing you can do to prevent it. Yeah, I'm still a bit salty. Of course, there are some things you can do to increase your chances of survival in the game's dungeons. The party formation lets you choose which of the heroes should take the brunt of the enemy's attacks, though the characters that do get hit still take full damage. The right equipment, a full inventory of healing potions, a good sense for when to fight and when to flee, and diligent use of spellcasting items will also go a long way. But the most effective method is also the most obvious one, even if it can be a little tedious. There are many things you could say about Final Fantasy, but to say that it's a perfectly balanced game is not one of them. A lot of weapons are redundant by the time you find them. Some spells are absurdly overpriced, while others are worthless. And the difference between high and low defense is absolutely staggering, to the point where an attack that barely touches your fighter can demolish your black mage in 2 hits. But these are all minor concerns compared to the more fundamental issue. Job balance is completely out of whack. Some party compositions are significantly easier to beat the game with, while others can be incredibly challenging to play. to the point where the party creation screen at the start of the game essentially functions as a difficulty slider. But that's totally fine, because as strange as it might seem to say, this is one case where game balance doesn't matter, and it all comes back to the spirit behind Final Fantasy's design. In an interview from 2012 by OneUp.com's Jeremy Parrish, when Akitoshi Kawatsu was asked about the implications of letting the player create their own party, he had this to say. The idea was to just let people figure things out. If you make a party of all white mages, you probably can't clear the game, but we weren't really worried about that affecting the balance or anything like that. This was the principle on which Final Fantasy was built. And the great irony is that not only was Kawatsu proven right, but he actually underestimated the lengths to which some gamers will go to assert their dominance over a favorite game. Because plenty of people have in fact finished Final Fantasy with a party of all white mages. There's even a rare few who have beaten the game with a solo white mage. There's no combination that's literally impossible to use. And it doesn't really matter whether one job is better than another, or that some monsters are way too tough, because whatever problems you're having with the game can always be solved by grinding. The fundamental promise of the RPG is that the more time and effort you put in, the stronger you become. And the stronger you become, the easier the game gets, which essentially means that RPGs let the players set their own difficulty in an organic way. And Final Fantasy definitely gets this part right. Each level gained is a significant milestone, and the feeling of stomping a group of monsters that gave you tons of trouble 10 levels earlier is exceptionally satisfying. That said, grinding in Final Fantasy can also be a frustrating experience. Leveling up is slow by modern standards, with levels capping at 50 and most parties expected to reach maybe level 30 before beating the game. While experienced adventurers can take a lot of shortcuts, it's not unusual for a first-time player to spend half the time on their maiden quest simply grinding for XP and gold. And the game's slow-paced tactical combat may be great for meaningful battles, but it's pretty frustrating when you're beating up monsters outside of town. In modern Japanese RPGs, grinding is often still an option, but seldom a requirement. And even if you're expected to engage with a bit of side content to stay on par with the main story, it's usually more along the lines of doing some side quests and extra activities rather than grinding battles out in the field. But that's not the case with Final Fantasy. If you want to make progress in this game, you have to put in the work. But this wasn't a problem back in the day, it was actually part of the charm. Final Fantasy is a game designed for children with nothing but time on their hands. This was an age before YouTube, before the Nintendo Switch, before even the internet. A time long before kids had 100 different free-to-play games in their online library and 1,000 other options for entertainment. In those days, NES games were hard currency, and the content on the cartridge had to last for a long time. Final Fantasy was an epic adventure that offered far more fun for your money's worth than the average game. It was meant to be played for days on end, sometimes weeks or even months. And if you had to do a bit of grinding to finish the quest, that just gave you something to do on a rainy day. And speaking from personal experience, it's really a matter of expectations. I didn't get a chance to grow up with this game as a kid, so my first full playthrough came in 2021. And back then, I really felt the grind. But coming back to the game 3 years later, after having finished the original Dragon Quest trilogy, I had a totally different viewpoint. My latest run was far smoother, much more enjoyable, and honestly, didn't feel very grindy at all. Of course, the fact that you can grind past any obstacle on your path doesn't necessarily excuse the game's flaws, but at least part of the fault lies with the game's code. Because Final Fantasy is an exceptionally buggy game. The one feature that blew people away when Final Fantasy first came out was the feeling of flying in the airship. Gamers were simply in awe of the sheer speed of the scrolling as you hurtled through the skies above the game's 3 great continents. This kind of technological achievement was thought to be impossible on the Famicom, and indeed, it took a genius programmer to do it. That genius was Nasir Gebelli. Gebelli is the very definition of a prodigy, the kind of guy who learned to write assembly by reverse engineering software on an Apple I, changing the instructions one hex code at a time and seeing what would happen. When he got an idea, he could sit down on a Friday night and work through the weekend and have a finished game by Monday noon, ready to sell. But Gebelli was also a bit of a maverick who did things his own way. The high-speed scrolling of the airship had been something he worked on in secret, so the rest of the team were just as amazed as everyone else when they first saw it. On a whim, he also added a hidden minigame, one of the first in the RPG genre, that no one would ever find unless they combed through the code. Gebelli could do things others couldn't, but he wasn't necessarily the most efficient or structured programmer. He coded Final Fantasy pretty much all on his own, and he said himself that he wasn't any good at organizing or explaining his work, or even functioning as a member of a team. In fact, the rest of the crew couldn't even understand his code most of the time, so even if they wanted to make changes to something he'd worked on, they didn't even know where to start. Which is probably why Final Fantasy has so many bugs. Some of them are pretty harmless. The house item records your progress before it restores your spell charges, so if you load the game from that save, your magic stays depleted. Upgrading a black belt to the master job is actually a downgrade, since the master gets less magic defense per level. And running from battle is a total mess. Your chances of getting away should be based in part on the enemy's level, but instead it looks at the status of the party member 2 slots down, which makes the whole process more or less random. Other bugs have more of an impact on gameplay. Critical hit rates for weapons are screwed up, with the result that most of them have an unintentionally high chance of landing a crit. The intelligence attribute has no effect, which means that a level 1 black mage and a level 50 black wizard do the same damage with the same spell. And weapons like the coral sword and the giant sword were intended to deal bonus damage to certain enemies, but this was never actually implemented, making some of these items kinda pointless. Worst of all, a lot of spells that would have been really useful are also glitched. Temper and Saber were both meant to increase the character's damage, but instead do nothing. Exfer is supposed to remove the enemy's special defenses, but it only works when it's used against you. Lock and Lock 2 should lower the enemy's evasion, but the first one always fails and the second one actually raises it. But there is one bug that arguably made the game better. In fact, it's become so iconic that when it was finally fixed in the Pixel Remaster version of Final Fantasy, it actually caused an uproar among older fans. Final Fantasy uses a set of encounter tables to determine which enemies the heroes will face in each random encounter. And each of these tables is tied to a certain region. For the most part, this works as intended, but there are some exceptions. Most of them are inconsequential, but there's one specific part of the world where it makes a big difference: the Peninsula of Power. To the northeast of Pravoka lies an arm of land that stretches north from the main continent. While the majority of this region is populated by the same monsters that infest the area surrounding the ice cave, a couple of tiles at the very tip of the peninsula crosses over into the Lufenia region, a part of the game you're not meant to reach until after you have the airship, and which is home to significantly stronger monsters. For some enterprising players, the so-called Peninsula of Power presents a unique opportunity, a chance to take advantage of the misplaced monsters and do some power leveling. If you bring spellcasters, you can head straight for the peninsula as soon as you reach Pravoka, but even my magicless party made it work from around level 10. The Peninsula of Power is the perfect emblem of Final Fantasy's nature, not just because it's one of many wonky little glitches that got past the developers, but also because it showcases the fundamental strength of this game. Final Fantasy is all about player choice. Within the Final Fantasy franchise, the first game is unique in one regard. It's the only single-player game in the mainline series that asks you to create your own party before starting the adventure. The choices you make on this screen are permanent, and as we've already established, they have a huge impact on the experience you'll have with the game. Fighters are the easiest job to use, but they're expensive to outfit in the early game. The thief can help you avoid ambushes, but only if you place them at the front of the party where they'll be vulnerable to attacks. The black belt starts out weak, but becomes crazy strong at higher levels. The red mage is incredibly versatile, but doesn't excel in any one area. And the white and black mages can be very powerful, but their limited spell charges can be tough to work around. Your choice of party determines how difficult certain dungeons will be, how much money you'll have to gather to pay for equipment and spells, and the tactics you'll have to use to succeed. Honestly, the difference between a party of all fighters and one with 4 black mages is like playing 2 completely different games. Your initial choice also comes with a bit of a caveat, because halfway through the game you will be able to make a change. Sort of. A highlight of Final Fantasy is the job upgrade, the moment in the story where the 4 young heroes transcend their humble beginnings and become true warriors of light. By retrieving the rat's tail from castle ordeals, the heroes can prove their mettle to the King of Dragons and earn Bahamut's boon. Fighters become knights, thieves become ninjas, black belts become masters, and mages become wizards. The job upgrade is an iconic moment in Final Fantasy lore, and it clearly inspired Cecil's transformation in Final Fantasy IV, which naturally took place at Mount Ordeals. But where Cecil's transformation from Dark Knight to Paladin was necessary for his story to work, the coolest thing about Final Fantasy's job upgrade is that it's really a choice you get to make. You could finish the game without ever visiting Castle Ordeals if you really want to. But party creation is far from the only significant choice the game will ask you to make. If you bring mages, you'll have to consider their spell selection, since a character can only learn 3 of the 4 options on each tier. And it gets even worse for red mages, who have to narrow down 8 options to 3 for most tiers. And since there's no way to remove a spell from a character's spellbook, you have to think long and hard before you decide. You also have a lot of choices to make when it comes to equipment. There's 40 different weapons and 40 pieces of armor in Final Fantasy, but you can't carry it all. While healing potions and key items go in a shared inventory, weapons and armor do not. Instead, each hero has their own personal inventory, with room for 4 weapons and 4 pieces of armor. If you fill that up, you'll have to throw something away before you can pick up something new. And there's no vault in which to store stuff you're not using, so you'll have to live with the choices you make. Spellcasting items are weapons and armor like any other, so they end up working almost like materia in Final Fantasy VII. They give access to spells, but each one takes up a valuable equipment slot. Since any character can use any spellcasting item, you essentially get to build your ideal party by assigning these items among the heroes. Want to have a fighter who can keep his allies alive? Give him the healing staff. How about a white mage with some offensive power? Set him up with Thor's hammer or Zeus's gauntlet. It's actually really cool. The sum of all this player choice is that Final Fantasy had an absolutely staggering replayability factor for its time. There are 126 different ways you could play this game, and that's only accounting for the initial party selection. Imagine how big that number would be when you factor in spell selection and what treasure to keep. Sure, some combinations of jobs are inherently worse than others, but that's all part of the charm. I would even argue that it adds to the game's replayability. Lots of people have done challenge runs to prove that even weaker parties can be made to work, to the point where large groups of enthusiasts have come together to prove that every single one of the 126 party combinations can be used to beat the game. And the same is true for any combination of 3 characters, and 2 characters, and even any of the 6 jobs alone. Which is just super cool. And none of that would have been nearly as interesting if the game had been perfectly balanced. I guess what I'm saying is, despite all of its perceived flaws, bugs, and general wonkiness, Final Fantasy is still a really cool game. And as it happens, a lot of people at the time thought so too. Final Fantasy's development had its fair share of ups and downs. When Sakaguchi first pitched his idea and got only 4 volunteers, there was a time when he thought it might not be possible to do. But he toughed it out, got more and more people on his side, and stuck to his guns no matter what. And towards the end of development, he got some help from a dear friend. Hiromichi Tanaka's B team pitched in to finish the game up, adding some much needed momentum to the final stretch. But now that the goal was in sight, Sakaguchi had another problem to deal with, and this one came from within. Square's leadership was still doubtful about the potential sales of such a product, and only wanted to ship 200,000 copies of the game. Sakaguchi knew this wouldn't be enough. At a time when the manufacturing process for ROM cartridges could take 2 to 3 months, the initial production run would pretty much decide the fate of your game. And if Final Fantasy only sold 200,000 copies, there wouldn't be a chance for a sequel. So Sakaguchi went to management and pleaded with them to make it 400,000 instead. Masafumi Miyamoto was hesitant to risk that much capital on a potential flop, but in the end he gave his approval, for which Sakaguchi has shown great gratitude over the years. Now that production was secured, the next step was spreading the word, but getting traction from gaming magazines proved difficult. When Sakaguchi took an in-development cartridge to the editor of Family Computer magazine, commonly known as Famimaga, he was turned away, being told that the magazine wouldn't feature something that competed with Dragon Quest. The only publication that was willing to give Final Fantasy a shot was Famitsu, and their verdict was glowing. In their December 25th issue, Famitsu awarded Final Fantasy 2 8s and 2 9s for a combined score of 34 out of 40, well above average, though a few points shy of the Dragon Quest games. Final Fantasy was a big success. The original Famicom version sold more than 500,000 copies in Japan, netting the company more than 3 billion yen. It wasn't the insane harvests Famicom titles had reaped during the boom years, but it was a more than respectable profit. Square's gamble had paid off, and no wonder. A small group of highly talented and highly motivated individuals worked very hard to bring Final Fantasy to market, but they also got pretty lucky. As one of the reviewers at Famitsu rightly pointed out, Final Fantasy had amazing timing, because for a period of 54 days, the time between Final Fantasy's release and the launch of the long-awaited Dragon Quest III, this game was arguably the most impressive Famicom RPG on the market. In an era when most console games were content to provide bite-sized, arcade-like experiences, Final Fantasy served up an epic quest, a vast world to explore, and seemingly endless opportunities for adventure. 6 different jobs to combine into your perfect party, 64 different spells, 80 pieces of equipment, and more than 120 kinds of monsters to engage with. And the game would have been even better when you played it as intended back in the day. Voraciously, splayed out on the living room floor with the fold-out map of the world, bestiary, and equipment charts spread out around you for easy reference. Flipping through a well-thumbed explorer's handbook to reference spell effects, armor stats, or general instructions. Collaborating with friends who were in the middle of their own epic journeys through the same world, but using a different set of jobs, spells, and weapons. And who could share stories of triumph and despair to counsel you on your own quest and steer you clear of common pitfalls. A lot of what seem like flaws today would have been draws in 1987. Without the internet to guide you, Final Fantasy would have been a true journey of discovery. You'd have to learn the game by trial and error, experiment with different classes, weapons, and spells, memorize the locations of various monsters and which ones were worth the fight and which to run from. You'd have to make notes, draw maps, and figure out the best approach to get you through the dungeons safely. And the final steps at the very bottom of the Temple of Fiends and the climactic battle against Chaos would have been a pulse-pounding, nail-biting experience. A memory to last a lifetime. Of course, when Dragon Quest III finally made it to market 2 months later, Japanese kids forgot all about Final Fantasy. Square had gotten the game out just in time to make a mark on the Famicom audience, but their freshman RPG couldn't compete with Enix's juggernaut. At least, not in Japan. Because when Square turned their eyes to North America a couple of years later, they found a very different audience, one which was eagerly waiting for a game like Final Fantasy. It would take almost 3 years for Final Fantasy to make it to North America, and even then, the decision to bring the game over at all probably wasn't an easy one. In the era of ROM cartridges, localizing text-rich titles was a difficult process. Not to mention that Japan and North America were seen as wildly different markets. North America was the land of action titles, and it was thought that American kids wouldn't be interested in a slower-paced title like Final Fantasy. But Square had seen some success in previous years with Rad Racer, and 3D World Runner had also sold well. So when Nintendo of America approached them with a proposal for licensing Final Fantasy for publication in the States, Square were all for it. But making an NES version of Final Fantasy came with certain challenges. We already talked about the steps Nintendo of America had to take to anonymize certain iconic monsters taken from Dungeons & Dragons in order to protect the company from a potential lawsuit. But there was also the matter of making the translated text fit. Japanese can say a lot more in fewer characters, so the translators had to get creative with the English names to work around the space limits. Spells like Blizzard and Thunder became Ice and Lit, and the classic black magic spell Flare was changed to Nuke. Equipment names also had to be shortened, but here they found a clever workaround. By introducing a series of generic icons to represent things like staffs, swords, and shields, even long names could be abbreviated quite a bit. The Ice brand, for example, was represented with the word Ice followed by a sword icon, and the Dragon Mail became Dragon plus an armor icon. Other changes came about because of censorship. In the 80s and early 90s, Nintendo of America had a set of self-imposed policies in place called Game Content Guidelines. For games to be licensed by Nintendo of America, they could not contain explicit content, excessive violence, graphic illustrations of death, or religious references. But since the exact limits on what was or wasn't too much were super vague, in practice, publishers tended to err on the side of caution. In the case of Final Fantasy, this meant the church where you revive your fallen allies became a clinic. The Medusa got some clothes to cover up her naked chest, and the names of spells with naughty words like death and kill had to change. Aside from these localization concerns, Nintendo of America must have felt the game was a great fit for the North American market, because the NES version is pretty much identical to the Japanese original. Still, they weren't going to leave anything to chance. Nintendo of America went all out in promoting the game, using their own Nintendo Power magazine to build immense hype. Multiple in-depth articles and previews, a full strategy guide sent out to all subscribers free of charge, and several contests with exciting prizes. The most elaborate being the Final Fantasy Treasure Quest, in which the grand prize winner and 3 lucky friends would be flown out to the British Virgin Islands to act out a real-life adventure following a printed journal written by the pirate Captain Bickey, while dressed as characters from the game. The tactic worked. When Final Fantasy was released in North America in July of 1990, it ended up being a huge hit. If Square had gotten a bit lucky with their timing at home, in North America it was godlike. The first Dragon Quest had only made it to the West in 1989, and it was downright primitive by comparison. In terms of scope and features, Final Fantasy was more in line with Dragon Quest III, but the third game wouldn't reach North America until 1992. While American computer gamers were enjoying incredibly sophisticated RPG titles like Wasteland, Pool of Radiance, and Ultima 6, such games were not available on consoles. Most Famicom games were straightforward action titles like Super Mario Bros., Mega Man, and Castlevania. But what the Famicom lacked in raw power, it more than made up for with reach. Computer gamers were few and far between. Console gamers were everywhere. With over 30 million units shipped in North America alone, the Famicom, or rather the NES, was in just about every home. The NES had brought video games into the mainstream, and for many kids who sat down with Final Fantasy, it was the first time they'd ever played a proper RPG, and the experience blew them away. Liberated from the shadow of Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy ended up doing even better in the West, selling more than 700,000 copies. And the game has consistently ranked as one of the best NES games ever made. For many young gamers, Final Fantasy was a defining moment of their childhood. The moment they realized video games could be so much more than just well-timed button presses and chasing high scores. For many, Final Fantasy instilled a lifelong love of RPGs and even gaming in general. So of course the adventure would eventually be repackaged for newer audiences. But in updating Final Fantasy for a younger generation of gamers, something of the original experience has inevitably been lost. On December 9th, 2000, almost 13 years after the game first came out, Square finally released a new edition of Final Fantasy for the WonderSwan, Bandai's Japan-only handheld console, the first ever major remake of this classic title. The WonderSwan version featured updated graphics, a streamlined interface, and a rearranged soundtrack, bringing the experience more in line with something like Final Fantasy V. It also had full-size battle backgrounds, more elaborate spell and attack animations, and visual feedback for things like damage numbers and status effects. Characters that target slain enemies now automatically picked a new target. Spellcasters could forget learned spells to make room for new ones, and a lot of the major bugs had been fixed. While the WonderSwan edition represents the greatest leap from the original, it was far from the last remake the game would see. Since then, there's been a number of other versions of Final Fantasy, and they've all made significant changes to the overall gameplay. In 2002, Final Fantasy Origins for the PlayStation added an optional easy mode where item costs are reduced, characters level up faster and get more generous stat growth, and spellcasters have more spell charges. 2004's Dawn of Souls for the Game Boy Advance got rid of spell charges entirely in favor of a standard MP-based system, and made easy mode mandatory. This version also introduced ethers, Phoenix Down, and stronger healing potions, and you can now save anywhere outside of combat. Most recently, in 2021, the Pixel Remaster series was released, presenting new versions of the first 6 Final Fantasy games for Steam, mobile, and eventually consoles. The Pixel Remaster features completely redrawn pixel art based on designs by Katsuko Shibuya, as well as a re-orchestrated musical score overseen by Nobuo Uematsu. While the Pixel Remaster made a return to spell charges and the marching order, this version also introduced an auto-battle feature that essentially lets you fast forward through combat, greatly cutting down on the amount of time spent in random encounters. And there's now an autosave feature that records your progress every time you enter a new screen. I also want to give an honorable mention to Stranger of Paradise, Final Fantasy Origin. Team Ninja's Souls-like action RPG provides a sort of alternate prequel/retelling of the original quest. It's a strange kind of alchemy, and it's not exactly canon, but it's far and away the most elaborate take on Final Fantasy's story we've seen so far. Granted, the game itself is a totally different experience from the Famicom original. But then again, when you get right down to it, the same can be said for all the remakes and remasters of this game. Dawn of Souls, Anniversary Edition, and Pixel Remaster are all a ton of fun, and they're probably your safest bet if you're looking for an accessible first taste of an old school classic. But they don't exactly provide the same experience. For better or worse, the countless tweaks and improvements that were made to each version fundamentally change how Final Fantasy is played. The fact that your characters now pick new targets automatically when monsters die means you no longer have to deal with the frustration of ineffective attacks, but it also makes combat completely mindless. The option to buy Phoenix Down and Ethers, items that didn't even exist in the original version, completely changes dungeon crawling, since you no longer have to worry about running out of resources ever. And it's kind of a moot point anyway, since the Pixel Remaster's autosave feature means that if you die, you just keep going as if nothing happened. While these changes make for a more user-friendly experience, they also chip away at the game's soul. Gone are the tense dungeon crawls that required careful husbandry of limited resources, clever thinking, and nerves of steel. Gone is the tension that mounts with each step you take deeper into the labyrinth. Gone is the triumph that bursts from your chest when the last hero, on his knees, dispatches the fiend with one final swing. Without these crucial ingredients, what remains of Final Fantasy is walking from point to point, following an in-game map that ensures you never get lost, and steamrolling your way through random encounters using auto battle. At what point does quality of life start to choke the life out of the experience? Final Fantasy wasn't a perfect game, far from it. But aside from maybe the way it forced you to rearrange your formation every time a character got poisoned, nothing about it truly needed to be fixed. It was, for its time, a complete experience, a unique adventure, and a crucial piece of RPG history. And whatever you might think about the game today, you cannot deny the importance of this title. Without Final Fantasy, the history of console RPGs would look very different. Because this is the game that saved a company. Before I go on, I just want to say if you enjoyed this video, I'd be super grateful if you could hit the like button and leave a quick comment, as it really helps the video reach more people. I read every comment I get, no matter how old the video is. And if you want to support me, consider subscribing to my channel so I know people want to see more videos like this. In 1987, Square's future as a video game developer was far from certain. It's unclear exactly how dire the company's finances were back then, because the story changes wildly depending on who you ask and when you ask them. But what is clear is that at the time of Final Fantasy's development, Square was still an unproven entity looking for solid ground in a fledgling industry. And even though they'd seen some success with a few games, they still hadn't had that one big hit, that foundational title that defines a developer. On a personal level, Sakaguchi himself was reaching the end of his rope. He had released some games for the NES, but none of them were major hits, and he was starting to feel like he wasn't qualified to be doing this job. With the company in trouble and no solution in sight, Sakaguchi wondered if Final Fantasy might just be his last chance to make it happen. It's often been said that the name Final Fantasy was chosen as a reflection of these circumstances. That it was Square's and Sakaguchi's last-ditch effort to stay in the industry. But in recent times, this notion has increasingly been challenged. It's a well-documented fact that the name Final Fantasy wasn't the team's first choice. Sakaguchi and the others knew they wanted a two-letter abbreviation that would sound cool in English, and they settled on FF. They quickly decided one of the letters should stand for fantasy, but when they tried to nail down the other one, they ran into a problem. Originally, the name Sakaguchi wanted to use was Fighting Fantasy, but this trademark was already used for a series of single-player role-playing books. After brainstorming some ideas, the team hit upon the name Final Fantasy, and liked the sound of it. In recent interviews, Sakaguchi has downplayed the importance of the actual words used, insisting that any two words that form the acronym FF would have been fine, and that there was no connection to the state of the company or his own feelings at the time. And yet, multiple people involved with the project have seemingly contradicted this statement. In a 2009 interview with Wired, Nobuo Uematsu appeared to confirm that the name reflected the team's feelings, that this was the company's last shot. And even Sakaguchi himself has contributed to the confusion. In a 2007 interview with Famitsu, Sakaguchi said, "The name Final Fantasy was a display of my feeling that if this didn't sell well, I was going to quit the games industry and go back to university. I'd have had to repeat a year, so I wouldn't have had any friends. It really was a final situation." We'll probably never know if Square could have survived without Final Fantasy being a success. During 1987, Sakaguchi's team alone put out 5 Famicom games. including Rad Racer, which is said to have sold almost 2 million copies in North America alone. And who knows, if Sakaguchi's RPG hadn't struck gold, we might have known Square today as a specialist in racing games. But in the end, it was Final Fantasy that ultimately gave Square not just the big hit they were hoping for, but also a clear path forward. More than any of Square's games before or since, Final Fantasy was a passion project. And the team that worked on it weren't exactly what you'd call professionals. Most of them were still part-timers. Ghibelli would show up in the office about 3 times per week, and every time he did, the working day would end in a drinking party. Sakaguchi spent many nights at the office sleeping in a beach bed he kept folded up under his desk during the day, and he wasn't the only one who lived and breathed Final Fantasy during these months. These were young men and women, most of them still in their 20s, with wild dreams and grand ambitions. And they treated game development not as a career, but as a hobby. The work-life balance may have been absolutely atrocious, but they were just really excited to be making this game. And the product they delivered reflected that passion. This was the game Sakaguchi had wanted to make all along, and now that he had proven the strength of his vision, the only way to go was forward. The father of Final Fantasy would ride the wave of that success to stardom, creating a juggernaut of an RPG franchise in the process. And this was only the beginning. 10 years later, Sakaguchi and his team would stun the industry by showing the whole world the true potential of Japanese RPGs. Anyway, I'm just some guy on YouTube, and these are just my personal opinions. Whether you agree or disagree, I'd love to hear about your experiences with Final Fantasy in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day!